Good afternoon. My name is Kim Brandon, and I'm going to be talking with you today about assessment and understanding by design, specifically aligning goals and evidence within the understanding by design framework. Before I begin, I just want to give you a little background on myself. I spent the first 12 years of my career as an English teacher at the junior high, middle school, and high school levels. And the last 14 years of my career as an administrator, the last 10 years as a principal at a middle school. And for the past 4 years, I've had the great opportunity to work as an educational consultant with Authentic Education. And that's really kind of what brought me here to you today. And so I want to get started. I also want to thank you for taking time out of an afternoon at this time of the school year to join us for this webinar. So our first slide is actually, when it shows up, it's actually a polling question. And I know that we're all at sort of in different places within schools or school districts, but I really want you to think about to what degree or to what extent, on a scale of 1 to 5, and 1 being consistently, 5 being never, to what extent do I do the following? To what extent do I articulate in advance of teaching the achievement targets that my students are to accomplish? And so as I look at this, it looks like we're seeing most of the time. And so as I'm looking, it looks like I don't know that we have a lot of people joining us right now, so I might be having a great conversation with 1 or 2 people out. Oh, we've got a nice group out there coming up now. So I'm not going to lie, as I look at this, when I put this together, I was pretty confident that we would see consistently or most of the time. So I'm going to keep watching this come in. But again, to what extent do we articulate in advance of teaching the targets or the learning goals that our students are to hit? And even if we're in the role of administrator, so if we're an assistant superintendent, a principal in a building, the same holds true. To what extent are we articulating in advance of the learning for our learners what the targets or the learning goals are? So just kind of watching a few more come in here. And as we watch these continue to come in and as people continue to join us, the reason I wanted to start with this is because if we're going to have a conversation about the understanding by design process and the alignment of goals and evidence, then we really need to be clear on how frequently are we putting in front of our students these learning goals, that we're articulating what the targets are, whether this is the daily targets. At the end of the day, this is where we need to be. We need to accomplish this. We need to be mindful of what, by the end of this unit, I need you to independently use your learning to do this. And really, we need to even think bigger than that. So if we're in an English language arts program, not only are we thinking about what our students need to be doing daily, and students need to be aware of that, but we always need to be mindful, and at the end of this unit, this is what you need to independently be able to do, mindful of longer term. What are the aims of the discipline, of the program? And so we might focus on the big ideas of writing and speaking and reading and think about, you know what, long term, I need you to be able to effectively communicate in writing or orally, mindful of the task and purpose. I need you to be able to critically read and analyze a variety of text for a variety of purposes. That always has to be in front of us, and we always need to know that we're working toward that long term, mindful of what we need to be working toward within this unit, as well as how we're getting there each day along the journey. So I'm going to actually move on to the next slide. Keep responding to that. So our next slide shows when we're talking about the understanding by design process, there really is a long-term goal that ultimately, as we engage in this process, our long-term goal is that we want to be able to create understanding-focused units designed backward from performances of transfer. It's really the GPS. It puts it out there for us. The same thing that we want for our students. We put out there for our students the GPS. This is our destination. This is where we're going. But as you know, we're here today, and we only have an hour at the most. And so what is our short-term goal? Mindful of that long-term goal today, if we've been successful, that at the end of this webinar, participants should leave with an understanding or a deeper understanding of the way in which the understanding by design process facilitates teacher and student clarity around outcomes or learning goals and facilitates alignment between assessment and those identified learning goals. which takes us to the next slide. And it's another polling question that I want to put out there. If there isn't clarity around our goals, if there's not clarity around the goals and the evidence we need, we could run into some problems. And so that's why I want to start right here with what we call sort of problem statements. And I've put 4 problem statements in front of you, and I want you to think about, if you're within a building or a school, I want you to think about, all right, within my classroom, within my school, or if you're in a central office position, as you think about your district, which of these 4 seems to resonate more with you as you look at these? And I will tell you that at any given time, probably all of these are problem statements that you're like, oh, wait, we've talked about this, or this has come up. And I will tell you that if you've ever looked at Jay McTagg's work and Grant Wiggins' work, you will know that they like to start here with these problem statements because they look at the challenges that they believe can be solved by using the understanding by design process. So I'm going to let a few more of your responses come in. Kind of look at this. So again, as I mentioned, really any of these problem statements can be issues that at any point we have to try and address, that we have to try and deal with. But the one that we're going to look at that sort of stands out the most right now is the one that talks about how a problem that we have within our district or within our school is that student performance on assessment is consistently and frustratingly weak, especially on tasks that require in-depth understanding and transferability. So what we want to do here, if we start with this as a problem statement or a challenge, then we want to begin with what are some possible reasons for that. And I've got a list here of some possible reasons that have been bulleted. And I want you to think about, all right, so given the fact that students are not performing really the way we need them to, especially on these tasks and assessments that require in-depth understanding and transferability, could it be because there's a lack of clarity on the big ideas, whether we're talking about the program, the course, or the unit? Is there a lack of clarity? And that lack of clarity, is that lack of clarity among teachers? And clearly, if the lack of clarity exists among teachers, then is that lack of clarity there for our students? And without that, is that a possible reason then that our students are not able to demonstrate understanding, much less transfer? Are we simply checking off content from a list? Or to go to the next one, are we afraid not to cover all the content because students have to be prepared for the next course? So I just want to kind of think about these. Are these possible reasons for our students to not be performing as well as we would like to see on these types of assessments? Are we not providing enough formative assessment and feedback? I mean, that's a huge thing. If we want to see our students demonstrating evidence of understanding and ultimately transfer, then along the way, we need to have them experiencing opportunities where they can engage in opportunities to explore understanding opportunities, and we can provide the necessary feedback along the way. But are we providing enough for them? Are we teaching skills in isolation with no connection to anything substantial? Are we confusing compliance with engagement? And before I talk about the last 2 bullets here, I want to talk just about a personal story with the compliance versus engagement, because I will tell you that as a principal, one of the things that we would talk about over and over is that we wanted to design learning experiences for our students that were engaging. We wanted our students engaged in the learning. We used that term a lot. And I also loved the fact that I would frequently engage in collegial learning walks with small groups of teachers. We would go in and out of classrooms in groups of 5, no more than 6. And I want to share specifically one example of a 6th grade classroom. We had gone into the classroom. We'd spent about 10 minutes in this classroom. And as we were exiting the classroom, and please understand that during our time while we're in that classroom, if there's an opportunity, we would sit next to students. We would ask, what are you learning? We would ask them, how is what you're learning right now? How does that relate to something you've done previously? How does this relate to something down the road? Or can you see how this might help you down the road? All of that would give us an understanding of, are they aware of the goals, not only for the day but longer term, but also we would try to read from that their level of engagement to the task. On this particular visit, as we were exiting the 6th grade English Language Arts classroom, every student was handed a graphic organizer. They were reading a particular text, they were handed this graphic organizer, and every one of us noticed as we left the classroom man, those students, they picked up that pencil, they picked up their pen, they leaned in, they started responding, they were filling in that graphic organizer. And I'm not going to lie, when we stepped out of the classroom to debrief, we all felt that what we saw there in the end was engagement. But there was one other person who had gone with us on this collegial learning walk who wasn't actually there but was virtually there with us, and it was Grant Wiggins, and he was there with us on the iPhone. And so looking at this face on the phone, this man started asking questions. And the first question was, I noticed that every student received the same graphic organizer. Did they all need the same organizer? And how did you know? Could some students have been able to have created their own? Did some students maybe need that, but other students could have drawn on maybe a repertoire of graphic organizers they'd used before? And then he asked, really, the question he wanted to get to, are you sure you're not confusing compliance with engagement? And we all kind of stood there because we were like, are we? And I will tell you at that moment, a quote or a question actually that had come up a couple years earlier when I had heard Allison Zamuda speaking. She asked of us in the audience, when did our students become paper-pushing bureaucrats? When did they stop asking why? And when did they start saying, I'm completely content with you handing me this worksheet? And at that moment, when I stood there with this group as we were debriefing, I realized, oh my gosh, we are confusing compliance with engagement. And look at us, we talked so much about looking for engagement in our classrooms. And I bring this up before I go to the next two bullets because right then and there we realized that was a huge problem. Because if we wanted to get our students to a level of understanding, to a level of transfer in a meaningful way, then we needed to be really clear on what it looked like for our students to engage in meaningful learning experiences that were preparing them for understanding and ultimately transfer. So we had to rethink how we looked for engagement within our classrooms. We had to shift the conversations we had as a staff. And so as you look at the next bullet, is there a lack of clarity as to what it means when we say a student understands? That's even bigger. Because if we say we want to assess for understanding, then are we all on the same page as to what it means to demonstrate understanding? And that gets to the next bullet. Are our assessments aligned to our instructional goals? Or could that also be a possible reason that our students are being presented with these assessments of understanding and ultimately transfer, and they're not able to perform well? So what is understanding then? What do we mean when we say we want students to understand the content and not just know it? What's the difference between really getting it and just regurgitating back what was taught? When I work with school districts and I go in and I work with teachers, this is a slide that I put in front of them as we begin our conversations. And you actually in the chat box, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask if you could sort of kind of add some verbs in the chat box. But I want you to start with the left side of this chart. If you know a lot but don't understand, you can only. And I want you to think about what are the verbs that might go on this side of the chart. I know a lot, but I don't really understand. So if you don't mind, if you could jot some of those verbs in the chat box. And then I want you to think about also, if I really understand, then I can do what? And what are the differences in the verbs? So as I look here, okay, so I'm kind of looking at some of the verbs. We've got repeat, we have observe. So those are really, if I know a lot but I don't understand, I can regurgitate. Thank you, Kristen. It's one of my favorites. And then toss out some verbs. And I know that I put out, I'm going to actually move this slide backwards here. But think about, again, what are some verbs if we really understand? So, okay, I know a lot, but I don't really understand, so I can repeat, I can observe, I can regurgitate, which is truly one of my favorite I know a lot verbs. But if I really understand, what can I do? Toss out some verbs for that. Ooh, Chris, thank you. I can interact, I can participate, I can replicate. Ooh, Kristen, thank you. If I really understand, I can apply, synthesize, problem solve, apply, explain, create. Thank you. I love these verbs. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we can clearly see the difference. I can lead. And when we look at this slide right here, this is actually a compilation. Grant Wiggins and Jay McTaggart, they work with school districts across the United States and in other countries. They started to kind of like, all right, so if we synthesize what we're hearing as we meet with all these different people, how do we capture this? And so they put this together. And so many of the verbs that you're throwing out there, if we know a lot but we don't understand, look, we're limited. We can retell, we can state, we can regurgitate. That's what we can do. That's fine, and there's a time and a place for that. But if we really understand, we can apply, predict the verbs that you were giving. I loved teach. We can teach others. And so that's the really powerful thing, that as we do this work, as we consider, A, are we being clear on what our targets are in terms of daily objectives to meet, our unit goals? At the end of this unit, students, you will be able to do this. You're going to use your learning to independently do this, mindful of our overarching long-term goals. We have to have clarity there. But we also need to be aware of, are our students achieving what we need them to achieve? And if not, why might that be? A big place to begin is the clarity around understanding versus knowledge. What is understanding and how does it differ from knowledge? Most specifically, what does it mean to assess for understanding versus assessing for content knowledge acquisition? And we really want to think about what's the key difference, especially if we want to align our evidence and our assessment with the intended goals and the outcomes we have for our students. So I put this slide up here because understanding by design, the understanding by design framework and process is a firm commitment to the understanding verbs from which we design backwards. So if you think of that T-chart, we're not designing backwards from our students' ability to restate or to regurgitate something. Instead, we're designing backwards from our students' ability to apply, to teach, to argue, to defend. If we look at this slide right here, it takes us into a history course. So if one of our goals is that our students should be able to independently use their learning to analyze and apply U.S. history, then it only makes sense that along the way, I need to see evidence of student ability to assess past and current policies, perhaps conduct oral histories, develop a narrative, but most importantly, I need evidence of student ability to analyze and apply U.S. history. So I designed backward from that, and I think, what does it look like for my students to be able to analyze and apply U.S. history? And I think about what along the way do my students need to be doing? What evidence, what learning tasks do they need to be doing to prepare them to be able to demonstrate that they not only understand but can apply and analyze this U.S. history that they're learning right here? So I've been using the language of backward design. Let's talk about the big ideas of the understanding by design framework. And so really, we can boil everything down to 4 big ideas. The first beginning with backward design that I've already begun talking about with you, that we design backward from those understanding verbs, those key performances that we're looking for from our students. Why is this important? It's about alignment. We have to have alignment. If these are our goals, then what does this hold in terms of evidence? And what does this mean in terms of a learning plan that will get our students there? If not, we run into the dangerous twin sin dilemma of perhaps aimless activities or mindless coverage. And so we think about, like, there are situations where we might have these great activities we've done with our students, but if they don't align back to our outcomes and our goals, then we have to stop and ask the question, why are we doing these? If it's not going to cause students to have a deeper understanding, mindful of the outcome, if it's not going to prepare students for their ability to demonstrate understanding and transfer, then we have to ask why. And the other thing is the coverage, simply marching through a textbook. A textbook is a fabulous resource. It is an incredible resource, and that's exactly what it is. It is not the curriculum, though. And so we look to our outcomes, to our goals, and they help us see how the textbook supports us and supports our students. Backward from those key performances, those understanding verbs, which gets to transfer as the goal. It's the essence of understanding. It is the point of school. And if we don't create those goals that show very clearly that you will independently use your learning to do this, and this is what we're working toward, everything we do is preparing for you for this, then students are going to fail to apply their learning. We need to create those opportunities. We need to set those goals. We need to be mindful of those goals that are based around those key performances, and those key performances come from those understanding verbs, and we design backward from that. But that's our goal. We have to get our students there. And they get to transfer through understandings, and they come to these understandings through big ideas. And so just as I talked about the program of English Language Arts, for example, some big ideas inherent within that program are communicating effectively in writing and speaking, and also our ability to read, to critically read text. Are our kids making the connections across the big ideas within programs, across programs, within our units of study? Because think about how we learn. When we're able to make connections, it deepens and strengthens our learning. Anytime we can sit down, we open a text, we join a webinar, we go to a workshop, we sit in some type of development. When we sit there and we have a little aha moment and it's like, wait a second, I totally see how this relates here, or I see how I can use this. We're making those connections, and we need that for our students. If not, we have fragmented learning. It's more difficult for our students. It's less engaging, which takes us to the fourth big idea of the understanding by design framework and process, which is meaningful learning. Why is it important? We have to engage our students in inviting relevant, meaningful learning experiences. So you go back to that very first if not, if we're just marching through a textbook, or if we're having our students engage in activities that, okay, fine, they might be engaged in these, but if they don't align back to the outcomes we need for our students, then is it really meaningful? Is it really relevant? And will it cause and get the evidence we need from our students? And you see right there that the if not, if we don't have the meaningful, authentic learning experiences in place for our students, they'll become disengaged. But the biggest thing here is they will see no relevance or authenticity to the learning. That's when we get the questions, why are we doing this? But if we've been very clear by setting our expectations up front with the students, so they know up front, this is why we're doing this, because at the end of this unit, this is what you'll need to be able to do. We should hopefully not hear that question, because the kids will see there's a purpose. There's a reason for everything we're doing. Everything gets me to that place right there. And so when I talk about the backward design process, there are 3 stages, which many people might be completely familiar with, but just a quick review. Stage 1 is where we identify those desired results, those outcomes that we want for our students. We look to see what is it, what do I want my students to independently be able to do? That's the transfer. What are the understandings I want my students to come to through inquiry? So if you're familiar with the UbD template, those are the enduring understandings and the essential questions. And then the other goals that we identify in stage 1 are the acquisition goals. What's the discrete knowledge and skills that my students need to acquire within this unit? And we identify that up front in stage 1. In stage 2, we determine acceptable evidence of stage 1. And where I'm going to spend most of my time with you is really around transfer, because that's the big deal. That's the point of school. We have to see our students applying their understanding. They have to apply it in novel and new situations. So we have to determine then, all right, if that's the transfer goal, then what's the evidence I need to see? What's the task then that will provide that evidence? And then, and only then, I go to stage 3. It is not until I have clarity around the goals and the outcomes that we've established in stage 1, and clarity around what is it going to look like, what's that performance, that task I need to see of my students that will demonstrate that. Once I have that in place, then I can backtrack and I think, okay, then what's going to be the best plan of action to get my students here? If we don't start there, if we don't begin with those clear goals in mind, with that task of transfer in mind, then the unintended consequence is that we might start in stage 3, where it's easy. It's easy to jump into stage 3. It's easy to start with, oh my gosh, this is a great book. Kids are going to love this book. Here's some great activities that go with this book. Or I'll give an example from my past, from my experience of when I first started teaching. You look right here, it talks about identifying content and skills to be taught. When I first started teaching many years ago, I was walked to my classroom and handed 2 books. One was Warner's Compositional Handbook, and the other was a literature anthology. And a key to my classroom was given a firm handshake with a good luck. And I stood there. And I went into my classroom, and I can't remember really what I started teaching with, but I will tell you, I turned to Warner's Compositional Handbook. And so it should feel like fingernails coming down a chalkboard, but I'm going to tell you, yes, in isolation, I pulled out an element of grammar. So let's just say it was verbs, that I decided up front I was going to teach verbs. That was going to be what my students were going to learn. Well, then you have to think of activities to teach these, and that's what sometimes happens. Again, if you think about jumping into stage 3 first, oh my gosh, we're going to study the Constitution. These are all these great activities, blah, blah, blah. Again, what's the goal? If we don't have clarity around the goal, if we don't have clarity around the evidence we need to see that they can get to transfer, there's a lot of danger of just jumping into stage 3. Because I will tell you that, yeah, here I am going to teach verbs, and then if a veteran teacher shows up and asks, do I need anything? What can support me? Well, I'm like, I'm going to teach verbs. And so she hands me all, I'm sure they were dittos, but we'll call them worksheets on verbs. And so here I've got my kids circling and underlining what's the helping verb, what's the active, what's the passive. We're doing all that and going through all these motions, so to speak. And so you get to time to give the assessment and determine the grade. Well, I gave an assessment that looked a lot like what I was asking them to do. Circle verbs, underline things. Think about what I was asking them to do. Think about the T-chart we looked at the very beginning when I asked you to give me verbs. I was not asking them to do anything beyond knowledge. I was just asking them to spit back information. And really, at that, kids could have been doing a lot of guessing on this. So it shouldn't come as any surprise that when I had my students engaging in writing, of course there was no transfer to subject-verb agreement or passive versus active voice. There couldn't possibly be because I hadn't helped my students see the big ideas for why we would even want to consider how we use verbs. I hadn't connected it to anything bigger. I had simply given them these discrete tasks. And this is an extreme example. Unfortunately, parts of it are probably very true. But the point is when you think about the different programs, the different classrooms where you are seeing different content being taught, are there teachers jumping first to the content or the skills and the stage 3 without really thinking about what are the goals we need to achieve? What's the evidence that will show understanding and transfer? And then thinking, how do I best get them there? And so there, I've bared my soul, I've shared my example. I'm going to take you right back to this slide, and I really want to emphasize stage 1 and those goals that I keep talking about, because it comes down to the learning goals of transfer, meaning making, and acquisition. These are established in stage 1. We assess for these in stage 2. We need to find evidence of transfer. We need to find evidence of meaning making, and we also need evidence of acquisition. But even as I say that out loud, you should be thinking to yourself that that won't look the same. It can't possibly look the same. So there are 3 questions we can start to ask ourselves as we sit down to identify the goals and then ultimately the evidence we need from this and the learning plan that will support this. So we start by asking in terms of transfer, what do we want our students to be able to do with content on their own in the future? What do we want them to be able to do with this on their own? I want my students to learn the Constitution of the United States so that on their own, they will be able to do what? It's not just about the content. Content is a means to an end. What are the key performances? Backwards from those verbs, the understanding verbs. Meaning making. What kind of thinking do I want students to do, and what kinds of understandings do I want them to grasp or validate? So what are those understandings that I need them to come to? Because it's through these understandings that they will be able to apply and show transfer. And along the way also, what knowledge and skills are needed to achieve these longer-term goals. So if we look at business, TMA, transfer, meaning, and acquisition in business. Okay, I need my students to independently use their learning to successfully market and sell a new product and optimize profit. Boom. At some point, they need to wrap their brain around and come to an understanding around these concepts, what it means to correctly interpret the needs, wants of customers, and price point data. So what are the inferences that they need to make? What are the inquiries they need to engage in to come to those understandings? And as I say this out loud, we need to be thinking, all right, so what does that mean then in terms of the tasks I need to ask of my students so that I can see evidence of this along the way? What does the task look like, or the evidence I need to see to know that my students can successfully market and sell a new product and optimize profit? And of course, along the way, I need to know that they acquire concept and skills of marketing, sales, and pricing. More specifically, if we focused on, say, 7th grade math, and it's got a lot of words in here, but if you look at this in this particular unit, so we get that the long-term aim in mathematics ultimately is that students need to be able to, or really, in general, we all need to be able to solve problems involving mathematics for which the solution and approach is not necessarily obvious. I get that. But at the end of this unit, 7th graders, I need you to independently use your learning to apply concepts and procedures for representing, interpreting, and solving multi-step ratio, proportion, and percent problems that are encountered in real life. Boom, at the end of this unit, I need you to be able to demonstrate that you can do this, and you're going to do a task that's going to show me that you can do this. Along the way, my students need to come to understandings. They need to understand that students need to understand that proportions represent a constant rate of change. They need to understand that there are different ways to represent or model proportions. And they need to understand that proportional reasoning can be applied to solving real-life problems. And of course, they need to acquire some discrete knowledge and skills. They need to acquire the concept of proportion, or proportional, as the equivalency of ratios, and acquire the skills of setting up and solving problems, as well as determining if two quantities are proportional and being able to solve for this. So those are the discrete skills. That's the discrete knowledge they need. So I'm going to kind of pause a little bit and give you a moment to sort of reflect. And if you can, first of all, I want to just kind of preface this that I have allowed some time at the end to answer questions. So as we move to the end of this, if you have questions, I will answer those at the end. But I want to kind of use our chat space if you have some thoughts or things that sort of pop up. I want you to think about transfer and meaning and acquisition in your classrooms, in your schools. So even if you're not in a classroom right now, if you are someone who goes and you visit classrooms, you observe classrooms, you evaluate teachers in classrooms, or you go to schools and you visit the classrooms within schools, I want you to think about the elements of transfer, meaning, and acquisition, because these are goals that need to clearly be established up front. Then what do we see in our classrooms in terms of how do we assess for these and how are we teaching for these? I really want to think about the proportion. I need to see the proportion. I want you to think about the proportion of time spent on acquisition versus meaning making. Do we spend more time on acquisition than we do meaning making? Do we feel as though, man, there are so many vocabulary words in this unit. Kids need to know every single one of these vocabulary words before they can do any meaning making. Grant and Jay always give a great example. They put all the parts of the car out, and they ask, did you need to know every single part of the car before you started to learn how to drive the car? Same thing in our classrooms. And are students adequately prepared to demonstrate transfer? So if you want to, Kristen's put something here, yes, there are. So I don't know if it means yes, they are, that our students are adequately prepared. But if you don't mind maybe putting something in the chat, but I'm just going to watch this briefly, and we'll move on to the next slide if we don't have a lot of comments here. Oh, thanks, Kristen. I appreciate that. Yes, so Kristen basically was clarifying that the yes, there are was in reference to the earlier slide about teachers jumping a step through without thinking through stages 1 and 2. And it's a dangerous thing, and it happens because it's easier to start right there. And so the challenge is to ensure that we have that clarity around our goals. Chris Mensch has just kind of put, in some subjects it seems easier than others, and I would assume just easier in terms of finding the balance between maybe meaning making and acquisition within our classrooms. Even as people who are, even as you are working with adult learners, sort of the same thing holds true. What's the opportunity that you provide for your adult learners to engage in meaning making activities versus the acquisition? Oh my gosh. So Stephanie just put, I just had a parent today who asked why their child has been taught something for several years but still doesn't know the information. Yeah, and it comes back to a lack of alignment, a lack of clarity around our goals, and not designing the learning experiences backward from those. I will tell you, a good friend of mine always tells the story of her children in third grade. Her first child got a teacher, and they had this big project at the end of the Civil War unit, and they had to do a diorama. And so the first son does this beautiful diorama, and son gets an A. And so the mom's like, just in case second son gets the same third grade teacher, let's just put the diorama in the basement. And so they bring the diorama back up because, lo and behold, second son gets the third grade teacher, and they have to do the diorama. They take it, they improvise, they add some things, put a little cotton on to make the look like there's smoke coming from the guns. Second son gets an A. Fast forward years ahead, although this is going to date itself, but there was a mini-series on years ago called North and South about the Civil War. Son number 1 turns to son number 2 and says, I really want to see that mini-series. Son number 2 turns to son number 1, and yet they both agree, yeah, because I really want to know who won that war. So right now, I need a little bit of a drum or a cymbal. But the bottom line, it gets back to what Stephanie was talking about. Man, those kids didn't understand. They didn't understand why they were making that diorama. What were they supposed to understand about the Civil War? And perhaps, if Stephanie's talking about the parent who's concerned, my child's been doing these activities over and over and over, or learning the same things, we're not getting them to understanding and transfer, because it's probably like my grammar activities. It's just activities. It's just lessons. It's just going to stage 3 without thinking through what are the outcomes and the goals we have, which brings us to the logic of backward design. It's an if-then. I'm going to keep saying that. Given what an understanding is, what has to happen both in instruction and assessment is students are to come to a genuine understanding and provide evidence of this. So I love this slide because it's about alignment. And if we are not aligned, if we are not designing backward from those key strategic performances, those verbs of understanding, and designing learning experiences backward from that, if we're just jumping in at stage 3, like, oh, I'm going to do these tasks, not mindful of what the outcomes are going to be, yeah, we'll have a misalignment. We'll have something like this happen. We'll have the problem statement that so many of you marked that our students are not going to do well in assessments of understanding, much less transfer. So we now look at those 3 questions I was asking earlier, but we look at them a little bit differently. So we've established our goals of transfer, meaning, and acquisition, and I want to step for a second. I want you to read the slide. I want to read what Kristen has just typed here. Oh, okay. So I'm going to jump to something Kristen Johnson has typed in here in the chat, and then I want to come back to this slide that we're looking at here. Currently working through teachers looking too broad at a standard or a concept. So there's a danger that sometimes teachers break down a standard too discreetly as a checklist, or they miss what's the big idea here? What's the big idea within the standard? And as we know, some standards carry a little more weight than others. And it's tough. Going to Teachers Pay Teachers, there might be some great things on Teachers Pay Teachers, but it's out of context in terms of what the goals are for your students, and there's a lot of danger there. And so really the conversation has to be, we have to have complete clarity around our goals given our students, given our curriculum. Which brings us to the slide that I have right here. Given the goal, what are we looking for? So if you go across here now, it's just those 3 questions I'd asked. They look a little bit different, but I want to now take you to this slide with the analogy of coaching to sports. If we think about transfer, if we think about that and the task as the game or the race, my husband is a track and cross country coach, then that's what we're preparing our students for. So if all we do with our students is we spend a lot of time around the drills and then we throw them into the game, they're not going to do well. They're not going to do well. So if you notice that middle slide there, and I get that the pictures are a little warped, sorry about that, but the middle slide there, that's the scrimmage. That's the game-like experience. So how many opportunities are we providing for our students to have that game-like experience where we can stop the scrimmage, not just call a timeout in the game, but actually stop the scrimmage, give really intentional, purposeful feedback, have the students ask questions, have the students rethink, maybe go back and practice some more drills, because it's in the game where I want them to be able to draw on everything they've learned previously in this new and novel situation, because no one can prepare kids for how the other team is going to come at them or how the other runners are going to run on that track. You prepare students for the race, for the game, as a coach by building their repertoire, their toolbox, so to speak, of the necessary knowledge and skills, but more importantly than that, those opportunities to take that and come to understandings around that and engage in meaning-making experiences so that when they are in the game, they can say, wow, all right, given this situation that I've never seen before, it makes sense that I need to do this and this. But in addition to coaching our students, we need to think like a judge. Following that logic of backward design, if that's the goal, then what's the evidence we need? Okay, think like a judge. Is there enough evidence of the right kind to determine achievement beyond a reasonable doubt? That's a great question to ask of our staff, to ask of our colleagues, to ask of our peers as we're having these conversations. If we're in a PLC, to put an assessment in front of us and ask that question, which brings me to the next slide. All right, what's the right evidence? So if I'm coaching my students for the game, then if I'm asking them in an end-of-unit assessment to select an answer from given data or to fill in the blank with a recalled fact or recall what the history book says, and you just look down that left side there and you think of the left side of the T-chart we looked at when we began this webinar. That's not enough. That's assessing for knowledge. But we all know that there are tests that we give to our students. There are assessments we give to our students at the end of a unit that assess for nothing more than this. So that's why we have to be very clear, because if it's understanding and transfer, then we need more authentic sort of game-like tasks for our students. So if you go and you look on the right, instead of just selecting an answer from given data, if I ask my students to interpret data based on real-world phenomena, that's much different. If I ask them to conduct research using primary and secondary sources, that's much different. If you go all the way down to the right, create a political cartoon to satirize a current event or policy. Look at that. That's huge in terms of the evidence I will see, the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt, evidence of the right kind. And so I put this chart in front of you. It actually comes from a blog that Grant Wiggins wrote back in August of 2014. And I really want to encourage you, it's always good just to go back and reread his blogs. They're fabulous. But if you don't have a lot of time, you're here for a webinar on assessment and the Understanding by Design framework. So if you just Google assessment, grading, and rigor and Grant Wiggins, this post will come up. And this tool that I've put up here on the slide is a part of that blog post. But I put this one up here because, again, we're coaching our students. We're coaching them for the game. We're coaching them for transfer, and we need to see evidence of that, evidence of the right kind. So we're thinking like a judge. So fine, let's take an end-of-unit assessment, and let's look at the questions we're asking. And a great activity to do as a staff or as a department is to take an end-of-unit assessment. If you have a common assessment, fine, you do that together. If you are all giving a different end-of-unit assessment, well, this is really powerful because where are our questions falling? If I've got 30 to 50 questions on this, I want to see every question and where it falls into a box. Where does it correlate? And if at an end of unit I see 1A or 2A or a lot of 1Bs, I'm assessing for content knowledge acquisition as opposed to assessing for understanding and transfer. Now, along the way, that's fine. There may be times where I need to assess for content knowledge acquisition. I need to see that you know this. But given the fact that I need to prepare my students for the game, I need to start seeing along the way evidence beyond that, and that the tasks I'm asking my students to do, the cognitive demand matched with the actual task complexity, that it goes deeper and deeper. Because think about it. When we get to transfer, we should be on the far right, down at the bottom. We should see that. Those are assessments of the right kind if we're looking for transfer. So I put this example in front of you. It's a primary ELA example. So think K through second grade. The editors at Story Inc. are looking for some tall tales to publish. In a previous unit, you were asked to write an autobiography. Now use that autobiography and turn it into a tall tale to be submitted to Story Inc. for possible publication. All right? That's a great example of an authentic assessment that's going to give me evidence of the right kind. But I want to show you this. I could have asked questions where I gave excerpts from different types of text, and then given multiple choice questions, I could have said A, B, C, or D. Which one is an example of a tall tale? Which one is an example of an autobiography? A, B, C, or D. Look at the words that are highlighted or underlined. Kind of sounds reminiscent of my grammar activities. Which of these words, phrases, or lines make this a tall tale? We could have done that. We could have, and kids would have probably been satisfied with that. But think about the evidence we would have gotten from that. Kids could have guessed, and it might just be that they know. What about understanding? Whereas here, look at the power of this. I'm asking them to go to a previous writing they've done. Boom, I'm putting text in front of them, and I'm asking them to read through this text, which happens to be the autobiography that they wrote in the last unit. But now I want them to draw on their knowledge and their understanding of what makes a tale a tall tale, and tease out from that previous writing the elements that they want to put into their tall tale. But now they have to adapt this so that they can create a tall tale. And obviously the other piece in here is that for possible publication. So what does it look like for a kindergartner through a second grader to think about how do I go back and look at my writing to make sure that this is something that I want to put in front of my teacher or for perhaps publication. We can put this in front of our kids or we can put the other in front of our kids. I'm not going to lie, the traditional assessment is going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot easier to grade. It really is. The other assessment, I'm going to have to develop a rubric. I'm going to have to calibrate. If there are more of us giving that assessment, which I hope there are, we need to calibrate. We need to make sure that we're on the same page. So I put this slide up here because transfer, that's the aim, that's the goal. It manifests itself in a variety of ways. And so Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe proposed that understanding as transfer is revealed through 6 facets of understanding. You think about that traditional multiple choice test, you're not going to see facets of understanding. You think about that primary example I shared with you, and you see that the students have to interpret. It's a different style of writing, and then they have to apply and adjust. Those two jump out right away. Assessments, authentic assessments of transfer, we will see the facets of understanding. And a valid assessment of transfer, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but we need to be very clear on these assessments. We have to have clarity around this and our goals because it's from this that we develop the other formative assessments and the learning plan. But these have a novel look and feel to the task and a context that requires students to tailor prior learning to a concrete situation. We don't put in front of our students a task that just looks a little different than one they did in class. It needs to be novel. It needs to be something new. It needs to be authentic. And it needs to provide students the opportunity to make these judgments and applications independently. It really is about being in the game. So if you think about, I had given you that 7th grade math example earlier, that students will independently use their learning to apply concepts and procedures for interpreting, solving multi-step ratio proportion. I'm kind of moving along here. I want you to look at this right here. I'll talk about the language to the left of this chart, but I want you to look at the situation. Your brother Tim drives the two of you to and from school every day in his car. Tim pays for gas using his weekly allowance. You and Tim are excited because you both just made the soccer team. Now you and Tim will have daily practice after school at the town soccer field on the other side of town. Attending practice means Tim will need to pay more for gas each week. Can Tim afford to buy the extra gas needed on his current allowance, or will you both need to ride your bikes to practice? Then you have the product that they need to create. That's going to give me evidence, mindful of that goal. And when you look at the standards and criteria, yeah, they have to create a data display. They're going to present that. But when you look at the standards and criteria, please look at that and notice it's not emphasizing the visual display. It's not emphasizing the color. It's emphasizing analysis and mathematical concepts and precision of mathematical language. It's focusing on the goals. So not only do our tasks need to be aligned, but the evaluative criteria has to be aligned. And so this right here is just an acronym, a tool that we like to use in Understanding by Design to develop these authentic tasks of transfer. So as you look at each of these elements, goal, role, audience, I love the fact that in that last task, it was a 7th grader who was really developing, a spreadsheet and an analysis for his 16, 17-year-old brother, like, hey, I'm going to do this for you so that you know whether or not we can drive or we have to ride our bikes. But the point is that was set up. It was a realistic situation for kids. I want to go ahead. I'm going to show you this slide, and I'll go backwards. I mentioned the piece about the evaluative criteria because this right here, the right evidence, mindful of the goal, 2-question test. Could a student do well on this assessment but not really understand? I'm telling you, when I talked about students could guess on some of those multiple choice, yeah, they could do well on that. Maybe they're good guessers, maybe they're good memorizers, but do they understand? Then I also want you to think about the task itself. If I focus on, for example, if the emphasis on that task that I had asked that 7th grader to do was on the presentation and the visuals, and I spent so much time evaluating that I lost sight of the fact that the impact criteria is really, does the student know how to apply his understanding of proportional reasoning to solve a real-world problem? That's what I needed to see right there. I needed to see that he could or she could analyze data appropriately, which gets to the next thing. Could a student not do well but understand? So that evaluative criteria is so huge, because if you could answer yes to either one of these, then the assessment is most likely not aligned with the goals. And so as we move toward the end here, the best tasks of transfer, those tasks aligned to our transfer goals, authentic to the way in which people in the real world use the knowledge and skills students are learning, authentic in terms of the opportunities and distractions inherent in real-world settings, and authentic to the learner in terms of relevance and personal interest. And so one of the last slides I want to show you, and you do, I think that McGraw-Hill provided you the PDF of this PowerPoint, but there's a link to a Vimeo. Years ago, Grant Wiggins had been engaging in a bit of discourse primarily with math teachers about authentic tasks of transfer. And he was sort of challenged that, when we try to create these tasks, kids can see through them. They don't see them as being authentic. And what was so exciting is that this teacher at this middle school in East Tripp, Indiana, took up the challenge with his students. And here's the story behind the task he developed. His kids knew he was a Seinfeld junkie. And so he comes into the classroom and he starts telling the story of how he and 3 of his friends had gone to New York for a quick trip. And they were so excited because what they wanted to do was find anything Seinfeld they could find in New York. A little disappointed that they didn't get to see much. They get on in a taxi or a train. They're riding back to their hotel, and they notice someone with a black and white cookie. And I put a picture of the episode with the black and white cookie. Kids, they're listening to him tell this story, and he's like, oh, my God, we totally geeked out, and we asked if we could take a picture of the black and white cookie. And he continues to tell the story of how not only did the person let him take a picture, but they actually gave him and his friends a black and white cookie. And he turns to his kids and he says, now I need you to help me solve a problem. How do we cut the cookie? There were 4 of us, and we each wanted to receive an equal portion of the cookie. We also wanted in each portion for it to be exactly half black and half white. We also wanted each portion to be in one piece, and no part of the cookie should be wasted. How do you cut the cookie? I'm going to tell you, when you watch that video, there is no question that those students are engaged. There is no question that they find this authentic and meaningful. This is something this is a story their teacher told them. It is truly authentic. It is powerful to watch that. I love it. I hope you get to see it. And the last few slides I have is that obviously we know it's not just the snapshot. It's not just that final task of transfer. We looked at transfer, meaning, and acquisition. We know it's a photo album. We know we have to find other evidence along the way, mindful of where we want to get our students in terms of transfer, mindful of the outcomes that we have established in stage 1. And so this slide again shows you if the successful transfer was should we drive or bike, then you can see some examples of what it might mean for our students to engage in meaning making versus knowing the content. Meaning making might be more constructed response activities. It could be experiments. It could be labs. It could be discussions. But knowing the content could be something as simple as an observation, an exit slip, a quiz. Evidence of the right kind, the logic. If these are our goals that are clearly stated up front, then what does this mean in terms of evidence of the right kind? I don't have a lot of time. If you have questions, I'm going to ask you to type your questions, but I'm also going to put my last slide up here so that if I don't have time to answer them, you have my Gmail and you can email me, or if you have questions specific to understanding by design or how authentic education can maybe support you, you also have that website. But again, if you have a question and you want to type it in the question and answer, I will watch for those. Thank you, Diane. I appreciate that. Thank you, Jenny. So I have to admit, this is my first webinar. So thank you for being my first webinar listeners. It was lovely to share this. As you can tell, I get really excited about this. So Denise, thank you very much. And again, don't hesitate. You have my email. Please do not hesitate to reach out. Well, I think that I will go ahead and maybe close this out then. Just a reminder again that McGraw-Hill, I love this. Someone just asked, will we be receiving a copy of the slides? So one of the things I was told, thank you, Chris, but one of the things I was told is that you could access a PDF of this PowerPoint. So I'm hoping that somewhere on this you have access to that. If not, again, send me a quick email and I will send you a PDF of all that. Oh, good. Someone just said, Kristen, thank you. The slides are on the right-hand side of the screen. It's in the stack of papers. Thank you, Kristen. Oh, the left-hand slide. Oh, I see the stack of papers on the left-hand slide. Thank you, Kristen. So yes, you definitely have all of these slides. And like I said, I really do hope that you get a chance to go and watch that video of that middle school teacher, because just to see those kids engaging in that task and truly engaging, not simply being compliant, it's really powerful. So I think that's everything then. So I will thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you if you have any more questions. All right? Thank you so much.